So I felt called to look into and remember the figure that is Frederick Douglass for this service this morning. We already saw a little bit of the story of Frederick Douglass in Bread for Words, story I actually didn't know about him. And also his birthday that he didn't know when he was born, right? He declared his birthday around this time and declared it to be February 14th, Valentine's Day. Just happened on Friday. So it seems fitting to talk about this usually first when it comes to mind Black history figure. Frederick Douglass is an ex-slave who escaped to freedom. He was an abolitionist and an orator, one of the largest names and loudest voices that helped start and spearhead things around the Civil War and end slavery in the United States. Yet the famous speeches, the books, the narratives of his life, his advocacy for Black people's suffrage and women's suffrage, the fact that, I didn't know if you knew this, he ran as vice president alongside the first woman to ever run as president in the Equal Rights Party ticket in 1872. That's right, 1872. None of that would have happened if he had not first escaped from slavery and found freedom. And I'm especially thinking of him today because I heard the news that in Maryland, the National Guard has exited from the parade of Frederick Douglass because they got an order from the government that they shouldn't celebrate Black history. I think it's important then that we look into this story, that we may remember Frederick Douglass and remember his history. And for me, looking at his journey of freedom, exploring his story through his biography, The Narrative of Life of Frederick Douglass, I can see lessons and values that we as Unitarian Universalists might understand about how to survive tyranny or authoritarianism in our time and rediscover freedom for all of us. So we heard a little bit of the story earlier, right? Frederick Douglass was born in Talbot County, Maryland. Born as Frederick Bailey, and born into slavery on the Great House Farm plantation. He was there for a time and then was given by his slave master to another owner and moved to Baltimore, where he lived with the Auld family. As we heard in the story, at first, Mrs. Sophia Auld taught him how to read alongside her son, but quickly, Mr. Hugh Auld put a stop to it, saying that that was the fastest way to lose a slave. Well, Frederick heard that and committed those words to memory and did everything he could to learn how to read and write. Over the span of 7 years, with the help of neighborhood boys who could help him to learn how to read in exchange for bread and food, he learned how to read and write. As he continued to grow from childhood into adolescence, he went on to collect and read everything he could possibly get his hands on. He collected different newspapers and political commentary. He avidly read as much as possible, and it was during this time that he stumbled across the abolitionist paper, the Columbia Orator. This paper helped further plant ideas of freedom, inspiring him to start dreaming of escape. Frederick Douglass, as a slave, went on to be passed to different slaveholders during his teen and adult years after his stay in Baltimore. At one point, he was sent to someone who was intended to break him. Well, during his 6 months with this slave master who meant to break him, he quite literally fought back so hard and diligently that the slaveholder was scared and stopped attempting to control or subdue him altogether. He was later then passed off to another set of owners, the Freelands. When he was with the Freelands, Frederick started advocating for his religious duties, a Sabbath school. He claimed he needed it for his religious studies, which at the time the master's like, okay, it's the Bible, how much harm could that be? Well, he invited nearby slaves and taught others how to read and write. At one point during that year, he had about 40 students, and it operated for over a year. But eventually, neighboring slave masters found out about the school and forced it to close. Frederick's work, however, seemed to be underway, though, as he inspired several of his fellow slaves to attempt to escape. Sadly, the attempt was not successful, and the others were returned to their masters, while Frederick was sent back to Mr. Auld in Baltimore. Though it was a heavy blow to be discouraged that this escape attempt didn't work, it didn't stop him. He went on to try to escape one more time, and then finally, on his third trip, he did escape to slavery, made possible by the help of a free black person who would become his wife, Anne Murray. They made their way to a safe house in New York State, and then to a free black community in Massachusetts. It was there, once he was free and with his family, that he would go on to further connect with abolitionist groups and start his career as an orator, which most people know him for. All of the story I shared with you was written by Frederick Douglass's own hand in his book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. And I share this story because I can see three fundamental things it teaches me, and hopefully us, about how to take ideas of freedom and blossom them into action. First is the necessity of education. At every turn of Frederick's journey, it is spelled out by Mr. Auld. He knew that education was the first step in gaining his own ability to make decisions about his life and to find more information and to find empowerment. Frederick not only did everything he could to learn about how to read and write, but he read as many forms of information as he could access, from newspapers to magazines to books and philosophies, and any minute he could, he helped others access education around him, even at the threat of his own life or putting himself in danger, like the Sabbath School, where he had 40 students in 1 year. And we see today that the same is true. We can see that our current administration's a little afraid about education lately. I mean, why would they be so scared of Black History Month? Why would they be so scared of us learning the truth of our roots of American history if they didn't know the threat that education has to those who are in power and authority? Between new DEI practices and policies, between canceling different federal holidays, we see the way that our different forms of administration are trying to rewrite, re-educate, and limit the resources of truth to our nation. And we see what can happen if we help educate each other and learn the truth about our history. Celebrating and honoring the cultures and histories of others has been happening this year as a form of celebration and revolt, and more people sharing the truth, whether it's in Instagram stories or in TikTok snippets, or whether it is in public celebrations of Black History parades. But we also see how sharing information, like Know Your Rights campaigns, can help stop some of the threats of tyranny, of authoritarianism, and to our lives. Know Your Rights campaigns foiled ICE agents in Chicago so much that the director complained about how Chicago wasn't working with him. And whatever our mayoral people in New York City may or may not say, there are people across New York State also spreading the news of Know Your Rights campaigns to help protect our neighbors and spread the education about what our rights actually are. This connects to our Unitarian Universalism because we in our faith believe in the responsible search for truth. We are a free faith. We call ourselves a free faith, and that freedom is about the freedom for all of us to learn more, to discover more, to discover the truth around the holy, around our human life and morality and mortality ourselves. We are called to constantly discover more truth about the world, to elevate science and engage in science, to discover our own spiritual paths. And with that freedom comes great responsibility, a responsibility to make sure that others have the same kind of access to education and spiritual freedom. The responsibility to know that it's important that we protect the dignity of others and their access to truth, to the real facts of history, and to education. If we continue in our faith to promote education about our rights, about the truth of our history, about the dignity of people, we can continue to restore and preserve our freedoms as Frederick Douglass found his freedom himself. Within the narrative of Frederick Douglass' life, we also see little examples of small actions of resistance. In my overview, you might not have heard them, but here are some examples from his autobiography. He would consistently poke holes in the ways that his masters would try to tell him why he had to do what he had to do. He would use his knowledge of the Bible to fight back against biblical arguments around slavery. Later in his life, when he worked for money, it was usually the case that slaves would work for money and give their coffers to their masters. He refused to do that because he's like, you didn't work, I worked. He would find every way he could to find little ways to assert his own dignity, including his Sabbath school or including literally fighting the person who was allegedly supposed to break him. Because of these small things, the ripple effect of his life happened. The Sabbath school started with maybe 1 or 2 people, but it grew to over 40. Today, amidst all the chaos that is happening in our country, we are witnessing countless small acts of resistance that people are building around us. We're seeing different federal workers who are holding the line, refusing to resign against those who are trying to buy them out, risking their own jobs and safety. We're witnessing every day neighbors protecting people from ICE raids. We have the most flooded calls to representatives in recent congressional history. And all of these small actions make a big difference. In our Unitarian Universalist faith, we know of our interdependent web of connection with each other. That web that connects us, that knows that anything that happens to us affects others, and what affects others affects us. And so we see how the little actions, little daily choices of resistance can make a big effect of building the network of love in our world. Finally, the lesson I'm walking away with is the lesson found in our reading today. Frederick leaves us with this ultimate lesson. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. I think about this especially when it comes to the ways that even I myself have quoted the Theodore Parker quote you may all know. I know the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, the moral arc of history. There's a way that it can be used to make it feel like progress is inevitable. But as we know, there is no bending the moral arc of the universe if we don't do the work to bend it. It is only possible for those who struggle to make it possible. And our Unitarian Universalist faith knows it very well, especially right now. I'm very proud that our Unitarian Universalist Association has joined with several countless denominations in a legal action suing the current administration for its recent statements regarding ICE being allowed within houses of faith. Our UUA knows that it makes our faith spaces unsafe and unwelcoming to all of the people we want to welcome, house, and help protect and honor in their dignity. Our denomination is quite literally putting the struggle into action so that more progress and more freedoms can be maintained and protected. When we as Unitarian Universalists continue to live into our calls to make our spaces more welcoming, to live into bigger love, we can struggle for the world as we know it could be. And in doing so, in that struggle, we dismiss the lies of control that others try to harness over us. I'm thinking right now of an opinion article submitted by Ezra Klein in the New York Times. Ezra Klein said in his recent piece that our current administration is not trying to be presidential. They're trying to act as kings, as tyrants. And they're doing everything possible to make our news, our country, our people, ourselves, our laws, act as if they are king. Ezra employs us to not believe it, to deny the power and the claim that they have, and to continue pushing back. This is said in Frederick's own words that we heard from Mira today. We see a similar truth. Quote, "The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress." Will our populace endure and believe the nonsense of what is happening to our values, to our religious communities, to our neighbors, our workspaces? I don't think we will. I think this last word from Frederick Douglas, ironically enough, offers me a little bit of hope. Tyrants are not all-powerful deities among us. They have limits, and their limits begin and end with each of us. We decide what power they do and don't have, and we decide by the ways we help in community and in struggle. I hope that we continue to live into the example of America's ancestors, such as Frederick Douglass, using our education, using our small acts of resistance, and using our collective struggle to create progress, to cut off all the power of the false rulers in our world. May we as Unitarian Universalists stay committed to a free faith, to the freedom and inherent dignity of all people, and continue to struggle for the world and country centered on love that we know is yet possible. May it be so, and amen.